Catholic priest, a U.S. president, an ornithologist, and a handyman enter a dense jungle on Christmas Day. Sound like the start of a bad joke? Well, it is, but it also happened in December of 1913, when Theodore Roosevelt went on a poorly planned, highly dangerous journey down an Amazon river known as the River of Doubt. Teddy Roosevelt served 2 terms in the White House before a time where there was term limits, but his first term was inherited when President William McKinley was assassinated in 1901 and he was serving as vice president. Teddy then ran for a second term and served as president until 1909, but then he decided not to run for a third term. However, he was a very ambitious and boisterous man, and he only lasted 1 term of watching William Taft be president, who Teddy thought was a joke of a leader, calling him a flub-dub, before Teddy himself decided to run as president once more. But Taft was also running for re-election, and they were both members of the Republican Party, which at this time was the less conservative party. And party leaders told Teddy, sorry, we can ensure that Taft is going to win. He's our nominee. But Teddy had lost so much respect for Taft that this answer simply didn't work for him. And he essentially said, I know I can't win this election, but I can make sure Taft loses. And so Theodore Roosevelt decided to still run, this time as third party for the Progressive Party, which became known as the Bull Moose Party because of Teddy's tenacity. But during his campaign in Milwaukee, Wisconsin on October 14, 1912, a Bavarian man named John Schrank shot Theodore Roosevelt in the chest in an assassination attempt, fearing that Teddy's run for a third term was an attempt to create a monarchy in the United States. But Teddy's heavy army overcoat, a 50-page manuscript, and a steel spectacle case that he carried in his breast pocket saved his life and caused the bullet to slightly change direction upon impact, lodging 5 inches near his ribcage. But rather than be rushed off stage, Teddy simply unbuttoned his coat and revealed a blood-stained shirt to the audience, shouting, "It takes more than that to kill a bull moose," and insisted on delivering the rest of his speech. 2 weeks later in Madison Square Garden, Teddy drew a crowd so large that his own sister Corinne could not get in. She had to climb a fire escape just to see her brother speak. The bullet was still lodged in his chest as he stood on stage, and the crowd cheered for 41 minutes before Teddy was able to speak. Teddy was one of the most popular presidents in history, and he knew he had enough celebrity to ensure that Taft didn't win. But what he didn't expect was that Democratic nominee Woodrow Wilson would absolutely sweep him in the ballots, winning by 2.2 million votes. Soon after, Teddy wrote to a friend, "I had expected defeat, but I had expected that we would make a better showing." Not only did this massive defeat sting, but because he ran third party, Roosevelt also made himself a pariah in his socialite community. Teddy was born into high society, and after this 1912 campaign, people he'd known his entire life stopped speaking to him. He hunkered down all winter at one of his homes in Cove Neck, New York, with his second wife Edith and younger daughter Ethel, and here he spiraled into a deep depression until he received a letter in February 1913 from Argentina's 2-year-old Museo Social, an institution devoted to progressive intellectual conversations at the time. They were asking him to give 3 guest lectures for a price of $13,000. This immediately appealed to Teddy for 2 reasons. One, it would give him the opportunity to see his 23-year-old son, Kermit, the third of his 6 children. Kermit had been working in Brazil for several years as an engineer. And 2, it would give him the opportunity to see the flora and fauna of South America. Teddy was not just a U.S. politician, he was also a respected naturalist. In fact, he wanted to be a scientist over a politician, but at the time he attended, Harvard favored lab work over field work, and that did not interest Theodore, so he shifted his focus. When Teddy received this letter from Argentina, he then wrote to his friend Frank Chapman, the bird curator at the American Museum of Natural History. Teddy wanted to see if he could partner with the museum to collect specimens in South America, as he had done for his African trip in 1909 after he served his second term in the White House. At the very same time Teddy wrote to Frank, a Catholic priest named Father John Augustine Zahm was also writing to Frank Chapman at the museum. Father Zahm was searching for someone to travel with him to Brazil, as he had made a trip in 1907 and wanted to return. Coincidentally, Father Zahm and Teddy Roosevelt were old friends, and Father Zahm was one of the only people who remained loyal to Teddy through his 1912 third-party election loss. In his letter to Frank Chapman, Father Zahm also happened to mention that he planned on visiting Teddy Roosevelt in upstate New York. And Frank Chapman wrote back to Father Zahm, "What a coincidence. Skip your trip to New York. I'm meeting with President Roosevelt to discuss a trip he's taking to South America soon. Why don't you just join our meeting?" Overjoyed, Zahm immediately accepted this invitation, and Chapman added Zahm to the lunch guest list without consulting President Roosevelt. I'll be covering the disastrous trip President Roosevelt took to the Amazon as I read this book, Candice Millard's The River of Doubt. It has been a long time since I've been this stressed out reading a book. I cannot tell you how poorly planned this journey was. So Teddy walks into a lunch planned by ornithologist Frank Chapman to see Catholic priest Father John Augustine Zahm sitting amongst the other scientists of the American Museum of Natural History. Teddy was very surprised to see Zahm there, as Zahm had actually been begging Teddy to take a trip to Brazil with him for over 5 years. But always the politician, Teddy quickly recovered and was like, "Oh, you! Just the man I was hoping to see. I was just about to write to you to tell you that we can finally take that trip to South America." Father Zahm had long been advertising himself as a South American expert within the United States. He even published 2 books on the topic under a pen name, but to call himself any sort of expert was an extreme exaggeration. Zahm had essentially only gone on fancy river cruises with a tour guide, which, to be fair, was way more than almost any other American had done in South America at this time. But Teddy Roosevelt and Zahm had very different ideas in their minds about what this trip would entail. However, they never really discussed what they had in mind with each other. To me, it almost sounds like Teddy didn't explain what he wanted because he half expected the plans with Father Zahm to kind of fizzle out and never come to fruition. But that is absolutely not how Father Zahm interpreted things. In fact, this meeting with Teddy lit a fire under his butt, and he placed himself in charge of planning the entire journey. Zahm began planning the route they would take, organizing their transportation, and ordering all of their provisions and equipment that they'd need. And Zahm almost immediately went to the sporting goods section of a department store in New York, Rogers Peet and Company, to begin stocking up. While in the store, he sparked up a conversation with the head clerk of the sporting goods department, a man named Anthony Fiala. Fiala was enthusiastically interested in the adventure that Father Zom was painting for him. So naturally, just like any stranger you've just met, Father Zom invites him on the trip. A man he literally just met onto a trip that he was attending with President Theodore Roosevelt. And then Father Zom puts Anthony Fiala in charge of ordering all of the equipment and all of the provisions for this trip. This is an insane move in and of itself, but it literally gets worse. Anthony Fiala was already notorious in the world of exploration because he had been a part of not one, but 2 expeditions to the North Pole, the second of which he was the trip's commander. And in 1903, on the journey he was commanding, his ship never made it farther north than 82 degrees because it was crushed in the Arctic ice and sank. For 2 excruciating years, Fiala and his 38 men were stranded in the icy north, surviving only because they managed to save half of their provisions before the ship sank, and because they stumbled upon supplies abandoned by other Arctic explorers. When he and his men were finally rescued, everyone in the exploration world knew Anthony Fiala's name. Now, Father Zom did let Teddy know that he had delegated these responsibilities, but it's unclear if Teddy knew who Fiala was, and regardless, Teddy still wasn't taking this trip that seriously, so it was more a comment that was said in passing. And because of their poor communication skills and lack of knowledge of South America, each man involved in planning this journey had a different idea about the type of boat they would need. Zom took the initiative to order 2 800-pound steel-hulled motorboats. Teddy's private secretary, Frank Harper, one of the only men taking this trip seriously and worrying about how poorly it was being planned, favored lighter steel-stamped boats, but Anthony Fiala was ordering canvas-covered indigenous Canadian canoes. He vastly overdid it with the provisions and equipment that he ordered. He truly purchased every luxury under the sun. He had a box full of just fancy spices, one full of just expensive olive oils and various mustards. He bought pancake flour, sliced bacon, 2 kinds of tobacco, malted milk, grapefruit marmalade, and even sent Teddy a variety of teas so that he could learn the president's preferences. The book tends to mock Fiala for these choices, but to me, it's very, very obvious that Fiala was being blamed for a horrible game of telephone. To me, it seems like Fiala might have read Father Zom's books and interpreted this trip as being a fancy river cruise for the president. Meanwhile, back at the American Museum of Natural History, Frank Chapman did have an accurate idea of what this trip would entail, having planned several different scientific journeys to South America. And for this trip, he recruited his best guy for the job, 48-year-old world-renowned ornithologist and veteran explorer George Cherry. At this time, George was honestly debating on retiring to his Vermont farm, but he spoke fluent Spanish, which is obviously helpful in South America, and this was a trip for President Theodore Roosevelt. He felt like he didn't really have a choice but to accept. To make Cherry feel better, Chapman also recruited another respected museum scientist, 26-year-old mammologist Leo Miller. Now, the expedition's ship was taking off from Pier 8 in Brooklyn on October 4th, 1913. But Father Zom wasn't done inviting random men on a trip with the president. At the 11th hour, Zom hired Jacob Sigg, a Swiss self-proclaimed handyman, to essentially be his personal assistant. Sigg told Zom that he was an electrical engineer, had operated steam engines, mined gold in the Andes, been the interpreter for an Indian princess, could drive an automobile, and that he spoke Spanish and Portuguese. With no way to verify any of this information, Father Zom was like, "You're hired." And this would complete the motley crew traveling with Teddy Roosevelt from Brooklyn to Bahia, Brazil, where they would then meet up with Teddy's son Kermit and a famous Brazilian military official and explorer, Colonel Rondon. So on October 4th, 1913, a 10,000-ton steamship left Brooklyn with Teddy Roosevelt and the random men he'd acquired, heading for Bahia, Brazil. Teddy's wife Edith was traveling with him to Brazil, which was unusual for her because she usually wasn't interested in or invited on any of his adventures. But this one was special because before Teddy headed off into the Amazon, he was going to be able to spend time with the third of his 6 children, Kermit, who also happened to be Edith's favorite child. Kermit Roosevelt has been a super interesting guy to read about. By the end of his life, Kermit spoke 11 languages: Arabic, Urdu, Hindustani, Swahili, Portuguese, Spanish, French, German, Ancient Greek, English, and most fascinating to me, Romani. Kermit was unlike the rest of his siblings in the fact that he was not a loud, excitable extrovert. He was quiet, a bit of a loner, a bookworm, and easily the most sensitive of all the Roosevelt children. But despite all of these qualities, he was more like his father than any of the rest of them, because he matched and even exceeded his father's love of adrenaline and adventure. Kermit traveled with Teddy on the African safari he took in 1909 after his second term serving in the White House. And during this trip, Kermit disappeared into the African bush with a tour guide for over 2 months, emerging an expert hunter and skilled survivalist. He was only 12 years old when his father became president, and he and his siblings were known to be wild and uncontrollable, using the White House as their own personal playground. Every morning, Kermit would put his pet kangaroo rat into his pocket and feed it scraps from the White House breakfast table. But while living in Washington, D.C., Kermit also contracted malaria from a mosquito bite. In the days before, the swamp on which the Capitol was built had been drained. Because of this, Kermit was subjected to random fever attacks throughout his entire life, and was entirely used to working through his misery. After attending Harvard like his father, Kermit moved to South America to work for the Brazil Railway Company, and then accepted a job where he was building bridges in the Xingu Valley. During his first summer in the Xingu, a bridge collapsed while Kermit was working on it, causing him to fall 35 feet onto his back in a dry, rocky ravine. From the ground, Kermit had to watch as the steel-wired bridge plummeted towards him, unable to move quickly enough to get out of the way. But he got lucky. The bridge fell next to him, not on top of him. He walked away with 2 broken ribs, 2 missing teeth, and a dislocated knee. Despite his adventurous spirit, Kermit was not supposed to be traveling into the Amazon with his father, because he'd just gotten engaged via writing letters to a woman named named Belle Willard, an heiress to the fortune of Joseph Willard, the American ambassador to Spain. Kermit had only met Belle one time the year prior, when his sister Ethel invited Belle to Sagamore Hill. Teddy was thrilled about Kermit's engagement, but his mother Edith was less enthusiastic. Edith, accompanied by the daughter of Teddy's cousin Emlyn, Margaret Roosevelt, had an ulterior motive in attending this trip to Brazil. She didn't just want to see Kermit, she also wanted to convince Kermit to go on the trip with Teddy into the Amazon. Edith had never seen Teddy as depressed as he was after his 1912 election loss, and she felt she had a more realistic idea of Teddy's physical capabilities than Teddy did, because on September 3rd, 1902, 11 years before this trip, Teddy Roosevelt was traveling in a horse-drawn carriage through Pittsfield, Massachusetts, when his buggy was hit by an electric streetcar, instantly killing the Secret Service agent William Craig and sending Teddy flying a distance of 30 feet, severely injuring his left leg. In the week afterward, his leg became seriously infected, nearly leading him to having blood poisoning. Because of this, a doctor had to cut all the way down to Teddy's shin bone, and the shock of this permanently damaged the bone in Teddy's left leg. Not only this, but because of Teddy's near sepsis, his immune system had been permanently affected, and he became extremely susceptible to getting infections. Only Teddy's immediate family knew about the disabilities he was living with, and because of this, Edith felt like Teddy was biting off more than he could chew with this journey. To make matters more dangerous, when his ship docked in Bahia on October 21st, Teddy met with Laurel Mueller, Brazil's Minister of Foreign Affairs. During this meeting, Teddy explained the river cruise that Father Zom and Fiala had planned out for him, but upon hearing his route, Mueller almost jokingly asked Roosevelt, "Why don't you go down an unknown river?" And always a daredevil, Teddy Roosevelt was essentially like, "Hold my beer." And he changed his route that day to travel down a river that Colonel Rondon, a man who'd been exploring and charting the Amazon for over 25 years, had named the River of Doubt because even he had not navigated down it. In fact, he nearly starved to death just trying to get to it. When Edith heard this new plan, she essentially begged Kermit to go with Teddy, knowing that she wouldn't be able to convince Teddy to go down his original route. Kermit had been extremely lonely during his time working in Brazil, and was really looking forward to going back to the US to marry Belle. But due to Kermit's special relationship with Edith, he could see just how worried she was about Teddy, and by the end of that day, Kermit reluctantly agreed to go into the Amazon with his father. On October 18th, 1913, Teddy's steamship docked in Bahia, Brazil, to meet up with Teddy's son Kermit. Brazil's ambassador to the United States, Don Domicio de Gama, had promised Teddy that the Brazilian government would help fund this expedition. De Gama said that not only would they help transport the 5 tons of baggage and various ridiculous boats his crew had acquired, but that they would also provide Teddy with a professional guide into the Amazon. And De Gama didn't just promise him any guide, he promised him the best guide there was, Colonel Candido Mariano da Silva Rondon, the commander of the Strategic Telegraph Commission. 48-year-old Rondon had spent nearly half his life navigating through the mostly uncharted Amazon, setting up remote telegraph stations. But much like George Cherry, when Rondon received the order that he was to escort Teddy on this trip, he was honestly annoyed. He wasn't really interested in being a tour guide, nor a president's personal hunting guide, a pastime for which Teddy was well known. However, this wasn't a request, it was an order, so he agreed to go under the terms that it was a serious scientific endeavor to accurately chart and survey the mysterious River of Doubt. Just to get to this river, Rondon would have to guide Teddy on a 2-month journey by land, from Asuncion, Paraguay, through the Brazilian highlands, before they could even begin the real journey by boat. 4 years prior, in 1909, Colonel Rondon and his man had nearly starved to death making this journey across the highlands. So when Laurel Mueller told Rondon that Teddy wanted to go down the River of Doubt, Rondon pitched 5 alternate routes to Teddy and tried to make them sound just as adventurous. But of course, Teddy had his mind made up. Teddy wanted to make a contribution to society by accurately putting this river on the map. Colonel Rondon has one of the most interesting lives I've ever read about. An indigenous man of Terena and Bororo descent, Rondon was born in a tiny town called Mimoso in 1865. This, unfortunately, was the first year that a war known as the War of the Triple Alliance broke out, which took place in the then remote western Brazilian state of Mato Grosso. There were no lines of communication from Mato Grosso to the Brazilian capital at this time, so when Francisco Solano Lopez of Paraguay invaded the state, the rest of Brazil had no idea. The indigenous population of Mato Grosso was severely impacted by this war, not just because of the violence they faced, but also because destruction spreads disease, and indigenous Americans were disproportionately affected by smallpox, as it was not endemic to their continent. By the time he was 2, Rondon had lost both his mother and father to smallpox, and by the time he was 5, he'd lost all his grandparents to the same disease. His maternal uncle took him in and gave him the surname Rondon, raising and educating him until he was 16 years old. At that point, Rondon moved to Rio de Janeiro to continue his schooling on his own. Here, Rondon chose the school that came with a built-in family, Rio's military academy, Escola Militar, but he did not fit in well with the other children here, who made fun of how socially awkward he was and how thin he was. The other students didn't know this because Rondon hid it well, but he actually was starving the entire time he was in school, as he was responsible for feeding himself and he had almost no money. And on his final year of schooling, on his way to a math class, Rondon collapsed on a staircase due to malnutrition. Not only was this because of his hunger, but it was also because Rondon was very disciplined and he was overworked, waking up every day at 4 a.m. to swim in the ocean for an hour before his work, a tradition he would carry into adulthood. He eventually graduated with a bachelor's in mathematics and natural sciences, and quickly climbed the ranks of the Brazilian military, getting promoted to military engineer by his early 20s. He played a pivotal role in the overthrow of the monarchy in Brazil in 1889, despite the fact that he was personal friends with the Emperor Pedro II. Less than 6 months later, he was chosen to lead the Strategic Telegraph Commission, which came to be known as the Rondon Commission. The Rondon Commission would send him back to his home state of Mato Grosso, returning as a local hero, and his expeditions laying telegraph lines would put him in in direct contact with the Amazon's most isolated indigenous tribes, which is exactly why Rondon accepted the position. Rondon's main passion throughout his entire life until his dying day was to serve indigenous Brazilians. In fact, he was so loyal to his fellow indigenous Brazilians that he cared more about their preservation and prosperity than he did about the men assigned to him through the Brazilian military. He had a strict no violence, no interference rule within his unit, meaning that even if his men were being attacked by a tribe, they were not permitted to retaliate or to interfere in indigenous versus indigenous conflicts. He was a staunch pacifist and positivist, despite being a military official, and he had no problem giving his own life or the lives of his men to better serve the indigenous tribes of Brazil. Much like Kermit Roosevelt, Rondon was a polyglot, speaking an impressive 12 different languages: French, Portuguese, and 10 different indigenous languages that the book does not list. However, this meant that Teddy and Rondon only had French in common, and Teddy only roughly spoke French. This is yet another reason why Kermit was an essential addition to Teddy's crew, as Kermit spoke Portuguese and could act as a translator for the Americans. But there would end up being a bigger communication problem between Teddy and Rondon than just language. Teddy was also a military official, serving as a colonel in the Spanish-American War with his own regiment, Roosevelt's Rough Riders. And unlike Rondon, Teddy, despite being diplomatic, was absolutely not a pacifist, and was absolutely not willing to give his life or the lives of his men in order to ensure the advancement of an indigenous tribe. In his early years, Roosevelt didn't even have positive feelings about Native Americans, famously stating, "I don't go so far as to think that the only good Indians are dead Indians, but I believe 9 out of every 10 are, and I shouldn't like to inquire too closely into the case of the 10th. And although his feelings for them tempered during his presidency when he began to see the real indigenous struggles, he also believed that if any man was firing at you, it was your right to defend yourself and your men by firing back. Being assigned to Rondon's unit eventually became a military punishment, not only due to his strict policy about indigenous Brazilians, but also because of how dangerous these journeys into the Amazon were as far as disease and starvation. In 1900, Rondon started an expedition with 81 men and came back with 30. Despite the philosophical differences between Teddy and Rondon, they found commonalities in their work ethic, their love of exploration, and their desire to accurately chart this river on a map. Once Teddy officially decided that he was taking the dangerous route that Millard now regretted suggesting, Teddy turned to all of the American men he'd brought with him and essentially said, "Listen, I know this isn't necessarily what you signed up for. I will not judge you if you leave." But to his surprise, every single man with him agreed to his drastic change of plans. And on Christmas Day, 1913, a boat with all of the American men plus Colonel Rondon left Corumbá on a boat called the Nioak, headed for a village called Tapirapoan. So Teddy and his crew left Corumbá on Christmas Day 1914, heading for the remote pioneer town and telegraph station Tapirapoan, where they would meet up with the large caravan of 110 oxen, 70 mules, and over 150 Brazilian workers that Colonel Rondon had arranged to carry the over 10,000 pounds of equipment and many different kinds of boats that the Americans had brought along with them. But the problem was, most of these animals were added on last minute, because Rondon had no idea just how much supplies they would show up with, and they had way more than he was expecting. So he had to scramble last minute to find dozens more oxen and mules in a very remote area of Brazil. And as a result, most of these animals were not domesticated at all. Teddy expected to arrive in this village to see a well-organized army of men and animals ready to take him on this 2-month trek. But on January 16th, 1914, he arrived in Tapirapoan to utter chaos, overtaking a small village of mud huts. The Americans were expecting to leave just 2 nights after arriving, and they quickly realized that wasn't going to happen. And Kermit specifically was immediately annoyed. He was especially annoyed with Father Zom, and he wrote in his journal that Zom was a foolish little fellow who misled Father greatly as to the conditions of travel and life down here. "I have been ready to kill the whole lot and all the members of the expedition." But it was in this village where they added Dr. Jose and Lieutenant Lira to their expedition, and they both would become absolutely essential on this trip. On January 19th, Rondon put a man named Captain Amilcar in charge of the oxen and mule caravan, and he ordered this baggage train to take off before the Americans, knowing that they would travel much slower. Then a few days later, Rondon, Teddy, and his crew would follow them, and they were heading for the most remote telegraph station that the Rondon Commission had set up, Utiariti. They were traveling across the Brazilian highlands, which encompasses more than 580,000 miles, which is more than twice the size of Texas, and therefore it has a wide variety of terrain, ranging from dense tropical jungle to dry arid deserts. This is the stretch of land that Rondon and his men almost starved to death trying to navigate just a couple years prior. And as a result, Rondon almost immediately began rationing food, ordering only 2 meals to be eaten every day. Only a couple of days into the journey, the men in both parties began to see animal skeletons laid out in the highlands from prior expeditions. Then Teddy's party began to encounter something even more ominous: abandoned, unopened crates labeled Roosevelt's South American Expedition, which meant either the mules and oxen were bucking off their supplies in order to survive, or the men in the pack caravan ahead of them were offloading the supplies themselves, realizing some of the crates carried non-essentials. Even worse, Captain Amilcar's baggage train had a man named Julio de Lima on it, and Julio tried to stab another worker traveling with them, something Amilcar will forget to tell Rondon and will come back into play later. But on January 25th, 3 huge all-terrain trucks pulled up to Teddy's party. They were Rondon commission vehicles headed for the Utiariti station. The next morning it was decided that Father Zom and Jacob Sig would catch a ride in one truck, and that George Cherry and Leo Miller would ride in another. But once they were inside the trucks, Father Zom was upset the entire way, because the driver he was sitting next to was black. From that point on, Zom incessantly complained complained about the ignorant and careless Negro and began referring to that truck ride, which he only got as a favor to Rondon, as a measure of how much he had suffered during the expedition. When Teddy's crew reached Sao Luis, Rondon was informed that the supply caravan had already lost 4 men. 3 soldiers had drowned trying to ascend the Gai Paraná, and a Captain Cardosa had succumbed to beriberi. By the time Teddy's party reached Tapirapoan, many men on the expedition were severely sick with malaria, including Teddy's personal secretary Frank Harper. Along with Zom and Fiala, Harper was one of the only men who truly knew the contents of the expedition's many trunks of supplies. He was also essentially the only man continuously saying, I kind of think all of this is a really bad idea. In Tapirapoan, Frank Harper would listen to his gut and he threw in the flag. He was simply too sick to carry on and he would be returning home. The rest of the crew would carry on and arrive in Utiariti at the end of January, and this would be the very last stop where they'd be in touch with civilization, as it was the Rondon Commission's very last telegraph station. And waiting in this telegraph station was a short, devastating message meant for Teddy Roosevelt. His cousin Emmeline's daughter Margaret, who'd been accompanying Teddy's wife Edith on her continuing journey through South America, had died of typhoid fever, the same thing that had killed Teddy's mother almost 30 years prior to the day. If only Teddy and his crew would have taken this final blow as a bad omen to not travel the River of Doubt, lives could have been saved. So in late January 1914, all of the Americans had arrived in the remote telegraph town of Utiariti, and there were also 150 Brazilian workers running circles around them to make sure that the supply train of oxen and mules were ready for the last stretch of the land journey. While sitting in this village, Teddy began to see just how essential the Brazilian workers were, and that some of the Americans he'd brought with him were dead weight. Father Zom specifically was sticking out like a sore thumb. He had not been in good standing with Colonel Rondon since his racist remarks about the black truck driver, and he was getting on everyone else's nerves. It was then that Teddy decided that Father Zom would not be descending the River of Doubt with the main crew, and that he would instead be taking a charted river back to civilization once the supply caravan reached its last stop. He also decided that only one scientist was needed on the trip, and with respect to his elder George Cherry, Leo Miller fell on his sword and volunteered to travel back with Father Zom. But when Father Zom learned of this new plan, he upped his racism game once more. He walked up to indigenous Colonel Rondon and said that he thought the best solution for him at this point was if Colonel Rondon could arrange for 4 strong Indians to carry him on their shoulders in a divan chair for the rest of his journey on land. By Indians, Father Zom meant members of the Paresi tribe, who lived in Utiariti and were good friends with Rondon. The colonel told Zom that the work that he was requesting was degrading and essentially to kick rocks. Unable to read the room, Zom then brought the same request to Teddy Roosevelt, saying, Indians are meant to carry priests, and I have resorted to such transportation several times. The next day on February 1st, Teddy sat down and wrote a letter that was essentially an official firing of Zom, and he had every ranking member of the crew sign it, adding Zom's personal assistant Sig's signature for good measure. A couple of days later, the crew left Utiariti on their final stretch through land, and they were already in bad shape. Both Kermit and Cherry had wounds on their legs that were infected, and Kermit was suffering through a bout of his malaria, forcing him to carry on with a 102-degree fever. By February 4th, it became apparent again that still too many Americans were traveling with the group, as the Brazilians were just doing 4 times the work they were, and unfortunately this time it was Anthony Fiala that Teddy felt needed to be cut. The men were ecstatic to see Zom go, but watching Fiala receive this news brought camp morale way down. Fiala was devastated and almost in tears. Truly, none of the Americans had worked as hard as Fiala to get this trip up and running, and this expedition was his chance to redeem himself after a previous crew of his was famously stranded in the Arctic for 2 years. Nobody seemed to think Fiala was an adequate choice because he was an Arctic explorer and knew nothing about the tropics, but they would soon find out that Fiala thought about many things that nobody else did. By February 6th, the oxen and mules were dying at an alarming rate, and Rondon gave the order for all men to cut their personal baggage in half. Stupidly, in Utiariti, the expedition had already abandoned the indigenous Canadian canoes that Fiala argued they would need. The pack animals were already overloaded, and they feared these canoes were too heavy. But this meant that the Rondon Roosevelt party would arrive at the mouth of the River of Doubt with no boats. A river expedition where they have no idea what to expect, no idea what conditions they'll be encountering, with no boats. This left Rondon with no choice but to purchase 7 boats from a tribe he was familiar with nearby, the Nambiquara. But the Nambiquara were also not prepared for such a request, and therefore Rondon received 7 clumsy, heavy, hastily made dugout boats. This is the first of several instances where I was saying, see, Fiala was right. And it's also the first moment where I screamed at my book, turn around. It's time to go back home. But of course, that's not what they did. And on February 27th, 1914, Teddy, Kermit, Cherry, Rondon, Lyra, Dr. Jose, and 16 other Brazilian workers would sit their butts in these heavy boats and immediately be swept away in a strong current. Colonel Rondon had the foresight to send Lieutenant Antonio Berenius on an entirely different journey up a different river called the Madeira, where he thought the River of Doubt and the Madeira would merge. Rondon wasn't sure how long the journey on the River of Doubt would take, and he wanted Berenius at this predicted endpoint in case they needed emergency supplies. So on February 27th, 1914, 22 men stepped into their 5 new, clumsy, heavy boats and started the first day of their river journey. Kermit and Lyra were in the very first boat, and their primary job would be to look out for landmark changes, because Colonel Rondon had only agreed to this trip so that he could survey it to make an accurate map of Brazil. At this time, the most accurate way to survey was called the fixed station method, which required repeated, detailed measurements on land. There were days where Kermit and Lyra would have to get out of their boat and dock 114 times, and this was not the type of trip the Roosevelts had in mind. They wanted adventure and exploration and constant movement, but they weren't in America, where Teddy would have seniority as a former president. president. Rondon was the ranking official in this party, and he was born and raised in this region. It was his word above all others on this trip. The first thing they noticed on the river was that everything was eerily quiet. This surprised and disturbed the Americans. They had expected to be able to supplement their rations by hunting, envisioning the jungle to be riddled with activity, but they vastly underestimated the ancient web of life here. Everything in the Amazon was in a constant battle of survival, and it only took 3 days for the first near accident to happen. There are more than 50 species of coral snakes in the Amazon, and on March 1st, Teddy Roosevelt stepped directly onto the body of one. The coral snakes in the Amazon are so lethal that at this time, tribes in the area didn't even bother to treat their bites. The snake's fangs sunk right into the thick leather of Teddy's hobnailed boots, but it must have been his lucky day. Coral snakes have very short fangs, and the snake did not penetrate his boots. He watched as the venom dripped down the leather, sparing him a certain and agonizing death. The next day, on March 2nd, as all the men were floating, they began to hear a low roar in the distance. Unfortunately, it was their first set of rapids, and they had no idea how their 5 boats would fare through them. They got lucky and bumped their way through the turbid water, but then they rounded a bend in the river and were astounded by what they saw. A series of violent rapids that lasted for about a mile and included 2 waterfalls. Not only this, but the river had narrowed from almost 100 yards across to only 2 yards across. In his journal, Teddy wrote, "Only one glance at the angry waters was necessary for us to realize that a long portage would have to be made." They had no choice but to carry all 5 boats and every box of supplies through the rainforest and around the rapids. This meant a grueling 2.5 days for the Brazilian workers specifically. They were instructed to clear a path through the jungle by cutting down a countless number of trees. Then to make 6-foot-long logs from the tree trunks, which they'd lay down across the ground to form something called a corduroy road. This road would act as a sort of conveyor belt to drag the heavy boats across with ropes, with one man at the rear prying the canoes forward with a lever. This would take the Brazilians 2.5 days to go 1 mile, which to me actually seems super fast. That same task would take me and 16 of my friends 2.5 months minimum. On March 4th, when they're docked making this corduroy road, the men woke up to see their camp absolutely infested with termites, and they had eaten through almost everything soft. Ponchos, duffel bag, helmet linings, underwear. Bugs would continue to be one of the more miserable aspects of this trip, especially given that malaria is spread through the saliva of certain mosquitoes. One of the craziest facts I learned in this book is that ants alone make up more than 10% of the biomass of animals in the rainforest. By March 5th, the men are back in the river, with the Brazilian workers having successfully carried all their supplies beyond the rapids. But it only took until 3 p.m. for all 5 boats to be stopped once more. Ahead of them were more treacherous rapids and 2 waterfalls. Immediately, everyone knew another trek across land would be absolutely necessary, putting the portage count at 2 by day 7. The second portage, carrying their boats and supplies through the jungle, took them 3 days to complete. These treks across land were not only depleting their rations faster, but they were also damaging their precious boats. And even worse, Kermit went on a hunt about 4 miles upriver that day and saw that as soon as they got around these rapids, they would soon hit another series of them. They got in their boats on March 10th anyway, floated for only 1 mile, and hit the turbulent water Kermit warned them about. The men were genuinely too exhausted to do another portage at the moment, so they decided to risk it and run their boats through the rapids. The 3 larger boats they had made it through just fine, but they had tied together the 4 smaller boats they received from the Nambiquara, forming 2 balsas. And the first balsa they tried to steer through these rapids almost instantly smashed to smithereens and nearly killed the Brazilian worker who was navigating it, and he sliced his face open when he smashed into a rock in the river. Carrying the remaining balsa through, the men set up camp that night, and luckily emptied their boat of all its supplies, because on March 11th they woke up to discover that one of their bigger boats had sunk due to rising water levels in the middle of the night. They were only on day 13, mile 75 of their estimated 500-mile journey, and they were down 2 boats. There was absolutely no way they could move forward with 22 men and 2 months worth of supplies with only 2 large canoes and 1 small balsa. They had no choice. They would have to construct 3 new boats themselves. For the next 3 days, they would be frozen in place at camp as the Brazilian workers searched for suitable trees to build new canoes. And again, I'm impressed with how fast they did this. On March 15th, they got back in their boats and only floated for 3 miles before they noticed a part in the river that split, forming an island in the center. But on each side of the island were 2 waterfalls. Before they even approached it, they could hear the roar of the dropping water, and Rondon immediately called for another portage. So 5 of the boats immediately paddled to shore to begin constructing a corduroy road through the jungle, but as soon as Rondon was out of sight into the rainforest, Kermit, in the 6th boat, defied his orders and demanded the Brazilian paddlers in his boat take him to the island. He was really annoyed with how long this journey was taking and all of the delays they were facing, which is pretty ballsy because he's not having to construct these canoes and he's not having to build this corduroy road. But Kermit wanted to check out the left waterfall in hopes that they could navigate through it rather than around it to save them another portage. At first, Lyra, one of Rondon's most trustworthy and loyal lieutenants throughout his entire life, and the other man in Kermit's boat, Simplicio, told Kermit, "No, I'm not defying Colonel's orders." But Kermit was rather aggressive in his insistence and kept repeating himself over and over again, putting these Brazilians in a really bad position. Lyra and Simplicio eventually caved, and they rowed Kermit to the island, where all 3 of them saw that Rondon was right and the left waterfall was not navigable. The 3 men and Kermit's dog Trig hopped back in their canoe to paddle back to where everyone else was at shore. But suddenly, a hidden whirlpool under the surface of the river spun their boat completely around and swept them quickly downstream, forcing them over the waterfall. Theodore Roosevelt and George Cherry were the only ones watching them from the shore, and they were powerless as they watched the 3 men go over. Miraculously, the little boat landed upright with everyone still inside of it. However, it had taken on so much water that it was now sinking. Lyra and Simplicio began paddling as fast as they could to shore, and they were almost within grasping distance of it when another hidden whirlpool sucked them completely underwater and spat them out back into the center of the river. Lyra rushed to the surface first and began tugging at the rope attached to the small boat, but the current was way too strong and he immediately lost his grip. The river itself flipped the boat over, and the last thing Lyra saw was Simplicio and Kermit desperately hanging on to the splintered, capsized hull. Kermit's jacket was so heavy and waterlogged that it was actually drowning him, but he got lucky and reached for an overhanging branch, which he was able to drag himself to shore with. And as he was doing this, he noticed that somehow Trig was paddling right next to him, and his dog would safely make it to shore. On Rondon's search for a path through the jungle, he emerged to hear the commotion of Kermit panting and coughing up water, where he demanded to know what just happened, then issued an immediate manhunt for Lyra and Simplicio. They almost immediately found Lyra on the opposite side of the river, exhausted, but spent the rest of the evening looking for Simplicio. In his journal that night, Rondon wrote that a manhunt was their one hope left. Unfortunately, the moment arrived when it was impossible to deceive ourselves. Simplicio was drowned, and wrote in his notes that he was officially naming the falls where he lost his life Simplicio Falls. Rondon made another note to himself to compensate his mother for his contributions to this journey. In Kermit's journal, however, he showed no remorse or responsibility for Simplicio's death, writing only 3 words in his entry that night: Simplicio was drowned. This video is in honor of Simplicio, who needlessly died on this journey. Thank you for your contributions to Brazil. On March 16th, they woke up in horrible spirits, having made another difficult portage through the jungle. They were all mourning Simplicio, and they were bitter about being back to only having 5 boats, but 21 men and 2 months of supplies. And at the spot they were currently camped at, there were no suitable trees to make a new boat. So it was official. Some of the men would have to walk. But the men in the boats were only able to float for 30 minutes anyway before encountering yet another series of rapids. And this one also had small waterfalls. Another portage would be necessary. But this time, Kermit, who'd been working as a bridge engineer prior to this, and the 2 most skilled watermen from the Brazilian workers, would be lowering the boats using a series of ropes, while the rest of the workers made another corduroy road to transport the rest of the supplies. During this time, Rondon decided to go on a hunt by himself, bringing only his dog, Lobo. Rondon had a long history of liking dogs more than he liked people, and he was kind of a loner. He needed time to himself in the jungle that he was born and raised in to recharge. But suddenly, as he was walking along, he heard the cry of a spider monkey, the largest primate in the Amazon, and Lobo took off running to find it. However, then Rondon heard the sound of human voices in short, energetic exclamations, which were all too familiar to him. They were war cries that the tribes in this region typically used, and even though he was listening intently, he couldn't understand the dialect that was used this deep into the jungle. Even he had never traveled this far, and as he was trying to analyze this, Lobo reappeared, and unfortunately had 2 long arrows protruding from his side. Rondon then knew that the tribe he was dealing with were called the Cinta Larga, who tended to use 5-foot-long, very thin arrows with a poisoned tip to kill their enemies. The poison came from a species of frog found only in the Amazon, which can carry enough toxin to kill 100 people, and need only to be touched to be deadly. Rondon knew he had no choice but to run. Had it been him who pursued the noise of the spider monkey, it would have been him riddled with arrows rather than Lobo, something I think Rondon would have actually preferred. He made it back to his camp only to be greeted with more bad news. One of the ropes had snapped while lowering one of the canoes they had just built days prior, and it smashed into a cluster of boulders at the bottom of the falls. Despite the horrible day he'd just had, Rondon took 5 men and doubled back on the path that Lobo had just lost his life on. He wanted to place gifts on the ground for the Cinta Larga, hoping to show that not only was he not their enemy, but he also wanted to be their friend. The only thing Rondon loved more than dogs were his fellow indigenous Brazilians. Thank you, Lobo, for your contributions to Brazil. And yes, I'm adding a dog death because Lobo didn't need to be on this trip. It was a needless death, just like the rest of them. On March 17th, after 2 horrible days in a row, 8 men in 4 canoes full of supplies took off down the river, forcing 13 men to walk through the jungle on foot. The only American in a boat was Teddy Roosevelt, who was battling a horrible fever due to malaria. The men had already gone through 1/3 of their provisions on mile 90 of an estimated 500-mile journey, so the main objective for the 13 men that were walking was to find more food. Just as they expected to be able to hunt to supplement their rations, they also expected to be able to gather fruit, nuts, and vegetables. But they had again underestimated this ancient jungle. The plants in this area had adapted to not grow in clusters of the same species, because the human rainforest is a breeding ground for disease. So for example, the Brazil nut tree, which is the main source of natural fat and protein that the crew expected to be able to find, had evolved over millennia to not be easy to propagate. If a Brazil nut falls on the ground and sprouts another tree surrounded by other Brazil nut trees, a single blight could wipe out their entire species. Therefore, almost all edible species in the Amazon had evolved to rely on complicated, specialized, long-distance pollinators. There are only 2 other animals besides humans that can open a Brazil nut: a group of large-bodied bees that pollinate their tree flowers, and the agouti, which has chisel-like teeth and is essential in the burying of the nut to produce more trees. Because of how few and far between every species was, the men would forage no Brazil nuts the entire time, and would forage almost nothing the entire time other than hearts of palm, a vegetable that's harvested from the center of many species of palm. By the end of the 17th, the men reconvened and discovered that near their camp was the correct type of tree to construct yet another canoe. But they also discovered that 15 of the 75 emergency military rations that Fiala had thought to pack were mysteriously missing, and though they couldn't prove it, the men had a strong idea of who had been sneaking food: Julio de Lima, the man who tried to stab another man while working on Amilcar's supply train of oxen and mules. Rondon had no idea that this attempted stabbing had taken place, and he'd specifically chosen Julio out of the other 150 workers because he was rather large and muscular. But it only took a few days into the river expedition for Rondon to regret this decision, because he discovered that Julio was far lazier than the rest of the Brazilians. Not only that, but he was prone to complaining, which Rondon hated. By this time into the trip, the men were exhausted and starving, and this would be the start of a long battle between the Roosevelts, who wanted to speed through this trip as fast as possible, and Rondon and Lyra, who thought this journey was completely pointless if they did not return with a precisely accurate map of the river, forcing them to take their time in surveying it. And Rondon actually told the men to take their time constructing this new boat, so that Lyra could use the fixed point surveying system to chart the new tributary that they were all camped out at. This lit the Roosevelts on fire, and they suspected that Rondon was stalling, so they began to intensely question the colonel on why things were taking so long. And to ease the tension, Rondon named the tributary, which turned out to be the river's largest, the Rio Kermit. And then he renamed the river they'd been traveling on, which he coined years prior as the River of Doubt, to the Rio Roosevelt. 3.5 weeks into this journey, the men had had their rations cut down to a quarter of what they were when they started. They were essentially on starvation rations, even though they were doing back-breaking work every day. And this started to bring out the worst of all their personalities. On March 23rd, a sergeant and engineer in Rondon's group of workers named Paixão, nicknamed Paixão, caught de Lima, who had already tried to stab another worker early in the trip, stealing a large portion of the expedition's already limited food supplies. So Paixão walked directly up to Julio and punched him in the mouth. This would be the beginning of an intense rivalry that would last for days. On the morning of March 27th, the men encountered yet another set of rapids, but this time they emptied their boats of all their supplies and were going to try to let the boats run through the rapids on their own. Almost instantly, their last remaining balsa got stuck between two rocks. Terrified of losing the two small boats that were tied together, the entire crew rushed into the rapids to try to pry the boat loose, including Teddy Roosevelt himself. And although they did save the boat, during this effort, Theodore Roosevelt suddenly slipped, striking his right shin against the sharp edge of a rock. And it was a deep, deep gash, one that Dr. Jose did not have the right equipment to treat, as they had been offloading things they deemed non-essential. Even though this was not the same leg that had been damaged 11 years prior in his carriage accident, Teddy still had a compromised immune system and was very prone to infections. At this point, George Cherry and Teddy Roosevelt had become like brothers, and in his journal, George Cherry would write, "From that time on, he was a very sick man. It only took 24 hours for Teddy to sink into a horrible fever and become almost immobile. By March 28th, Teddy was so sick that he was advising Cherry and Kermit to leave him there, to let him perish in the jungle. He feared that the rest of the men would not make it out if they had to also carry him. And that evening, he told Cherry a secret. In Teddy's personal belongings was a hidden vial of a lethal amount of morphine that he brought for a worst-case scenario. Teddy knew Kermit would not leave him, so he was appealing to Cherry. And he said, 'I realize that some of us are not going to finish this journey. Cherry, I want you and Kermit to go on. You can get out. I will stop here.' Of course, Cherry also did not plan on letting this happen. But Roosevelt was right about one thing. Some of them would not be finishing this journey. On April 3rd, the men encountered yet another set of rapids, which the men decided they would try to navigate through. But after removing all of the supplies from the boats and sending them through the river, almost immediately one of the larger boats spun out of control. Everyone watched from the shore as the canoe was demolished against the big boulders. They got the other boats through safely, but now they had to find a route up a canyon in order to get their supplies to the other side of the river. Rondon ordered one of his most trustworthy men named Pedrino to watch over the supplies on shore as he and the other men tried to find a route. They eventually discovered a way to get everything upriver, then circled back to Pedrino to start hauling each box one by one through the canyon. But Pedrino noticed that Julio de Lima snuck off with his box, while everyone else was hauling it over the canyon. After waiting a few moments, Pedrino followed him and caught him sneaking more emergency rations for himself. This time it was dried meat, a particularly treasured commodity. Pedrino took this information to his superior, Paixão, who already had a tense relationship with Julio. But because they were so far from civilization and Julio was still one of the strongest, albeit laziest members of the crew, all Paixão could really do was admonish him. Already annoyed with Julio, Paixão got on his case yet again during the hauling of supplies, saying that Julio was carrying the least amount of stuff despite being the biggest guy there. When Julio arrived at the end camp, Cherry and Kermit were reading as they watched over the extremely ill Teddy. Cherry watched Julio walk over to a set of rifles and take one into the woods, something that was not unusual for anyone on the crew to do if they saw something that they could hunt. Moments later, Cherry and Kermit heard the gun fire, and they were hopeful that they would have fresh meat. But then they heard 3 Brazilians running towards them in a breathless panic, screaming, "Julio has killed Paixão! Julio has killed Paixão!" On April 3rd, when he heard the Brazilians shouting that Julio de Lima had fatally shot Sergeant Paixão, Teddy Roosevelt raced out of his bed despite being feverish and nearly immobile, and he rushed through the jungle with Kermit and Cherry, all 3 of them armed. It did not take them very long to come across Sergeant Paixão, who was lying lifeless on the ground, and Julio de Lima was nowhere in sight. Panicked, the men rushed towards Pedrino, fearing that Julio was going to go on a killing spree and that he would be the next victim due to their altercation that morning. But when they arrived, they found Pedrino alive, casually speaking with Rondon, and Roosevelt frantically broke the news to Rondon that Julio had just killed Sergeant Paixão. Rondon went into a red-hot rage. Like Lyra, Sergeant Paixão was one of his most trusted men who went on almost every mission with him. There were also potential racial undertones of this attack. Paixão was a black superior and Julio was a white Portuguese subordinate. Rondon issued an immediate manhunt for Julio, as they all knew he was armed and dangerous. Now, not only were the 19 remaining men starving, they'd also have to have a constant guard on duty to make sure that Julio didn't steal their stuff while they were sleeping, or worse, attack them. Roosevelt and pacifist Rondon were in agreement. Julio had to die. It was simply too risky to transport him as a prisoner. The men backtracked to the scene of the crime to see if Julio left any sort of path so that they could track him, and they found one. And not long after following it, they saw that Julio dropped his rifle when fleeing. Most likely one of the many vines he had to navigate through snatched it from his grip. However, Julio himself was nowhere to be found. Though the men could rest a little easier knowing that he had no rifle, they would still have to keep watch overnight to make sure he couldn't steal anything. Everyone then shifted their attention to Paishon. There was nothing more they could do except bury him. Rondon ordered that he be buried in the exact position he fell, with his feet towards the waterfall and his face towards the jungle, and he named the spot they were standing at Paishon Canyon. With all of the energy that he exerted in the manhunt for Julio, on the night of April 4th, Teddy Roosevelt spiraled into a fever that was so horrible that he was now immobile and barely conscious. Dr. Jose was begging Teddy to let him operate on the extremely infected leg, but Teddy continuously refused because the surgery he had on his other leg from his other accident almost resulted in him having to have his leg amputated. The next day on April 5th, Teddy was absolutely delirious in his fever, and he began reciting in a chant over and over again the opening lines to Samuel Taylor Coleridge's rhythmic poem Kubla Khan.
In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasuredome decree. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasuredome decree.
As the night wore on, Teddy would have these moments of complete clarity where he asked if Cherry had eaten enough, then fall into deliriousness where he didn't even recognize Kermit. For a change, they woke up on the 6th to good news. They were through the rapids. Teddy's fever broke and he was once more upright and lucid. And there were no mountains that they could see, indicating they wouldn't hit rapids for a very long time. The expedition would finally be leaving Paishon Canyon. Rondon and Lyra headed out on the first boat to enjoy the cruise and clean their surveying instruments. But as the men were bent over working, they heard the faint voice of a man calling out to them from the bank on their left. Someone was hanging on to a broad tree branch that hung over the river, and with a hoarse voice shouting, "Senor Colonel! Senor Colonel!" Rondon immediately recognized the figure. It was Julio de Lima screaming out for sympathy. If he was expecting compassion and mercy from Rondon, he was sorely mistaken. Without even looking up, Rondon replied, "It is not possible for me to stop the canoe now and to interrupt the survey. Besides, it is best to wait for Mr. Roosevelt." Lyra and Rondon floated right by the desperate murderer, knowing full well Teddy Roosevelt would do the same or worse. When Dr. Jose, Kermit, Cherry, and Theodore floated by, they refused to even look at Julio, much less help him. Both parties deserted the man, knowing full well the chances of him surviving on his own were slim to none. Julio's only shot at survival would be to appeal to the Cinta Larga, who were rightfully hostile to outsiders due to their deadly encounters with rubber tappers, men who were colonizing the Amazon in order to harvest rubber. According to the author Candice Millard's interview with the Cinta Larga, a tribe that passes on stories through oral narration, their ancestors around this time did encounter a European man begging for mercy and food, offering his knife to them in exchange for helping him survive. The Cinta Larga allegedly accepted this trade and handed him food in exchange for the hand blade, then watched him eat, and then came up behind him and with his very own knife. They'd lost Simplicio, lost Paishon, abandoned Julio, and nearly every member of the crew was dying for one reason or another, except the indestructible Rondon, who was born and raised in this region. But easily the man in the worst shape was still Teddy Roosevelt. By April 10th, the men were down to eating one soda cracker a day, and if they were lucky and caught one portion of fish. And therefore, there were many instances of sneaking food. It was not just Julio who was desperate enough to take more for themselves. Not only were they starving, but they'd also kind of started to go stir crazy, because when you're in a dense jungle like the Amazon, you really can't ever see the horizon. And this can take a severe mental toll. But on April 11th, one of the Brazilians named Luis came back from fishing with great news. He'd seen an area upriver that looked as if it had been cleared with an axe, a tool that the tribes in this area typically did not use. And this meant that they might soon be crossing paths with one of the rubber tappers that was colonizing the Amazon. When Henry Ford introduced the Model T in 1908, the Amazon was the world's sole source of rubber, even though rubber is naturally found in many other places. But suddenly, this had become one of the most sought-after natural resources on Earth, and a frenzy that rivaled California's gold rush swept through Brazil. Rubber tapping was a tough job for a solo worker. By 10 a.m., any given tapper might have already visited 150 to 180 trees, emptying the small zinc bowls they had already attached to the tree to capture the latex that oozed out of the incision they had previously made in the bark. They would then bring that latex back to their camp, where they'd pour it onto a wooden spit that had to be spun over and over again over a fire until it slowly coagulated into thin, even layers. It could take weeks of this relentless process to produce a ball of rubber that was heavy enough to sell, roughly 60 to 150 pounds. Now, under normal circumstances, I can imagine that the sight of rubber tappers enraged Rondon, as he himself was indigenous and tappers were particularly cruel to the indigenous population. But in this case, he was ecstatic. He was not willing to have a U.S. president die on his watch, and sight of rubber tappers meant that his prior theory was correct. The River of Doubt must eventually merge with the Madeira, where he had had the foresight to send Lieutenant Pirinius to travel with emergency rations and supplies, and they really needed food. On April 13th, several of the Brazilian workers almost died, consuming a nut that none of them could identify. They were violently ill for days, and Dr. Jose thought he'd lose them all. But then on April 15th, the men encountered a small white house. They yelled and screamed for anyone to come outside, but nobody answered, so they finally tried the door of the house for themselves, and it opened to reveal a house empty of people, but entirely stocked with fresh produce. But this is how disciplined Rondon was. He immediately ordered the food not to be touched, and for the men to get back into their boats. He knew that someone else worked hard to get that food there, and it did not belong to them. However, they only had to float for one more mile before they encountered a person, an actual person, in a canoe. It was a solo rubber tapper named Raimundo Jose Marquez. Rondon took his hat off and frantically waved it at Raimundo to signal that he was coming peacefully. Raimundo cautiously paddled over and began to see just how bad of shape these men were in. They truly looked abysmal. One man could not even lift himself to greet Raimundo. Raimundo. That's Theodore Roosevelt, Rondon told him. But Raimundo was like, am I supposed to know who the fuck that is? Raimundo was one of the poorest rubber tappers in the region, so he told them, unfortunately, I don't have supplies or food that I can spare, but he did have some advice for them. The next tapper you see upriver, fire your gun into the air 3 times and blow into this bamboo horn I'm gonna give you. So they continued on, and it didn't take them long to encounter yet another house, and this time they could see that people were home. There were 2 children playing in the yard. Without thinking and excited, the men fired the gun into the air 3 times, and of course the children began screaming at the top of their lungs. They ran inside, their mother ran back out with 2 children tucked under her arm, and she took off down a path into the woods. And the men were screaming that they meant no harm, but she was long gone. She wasn't taking any chances, and she thought they were under attack. They docked and went up to her house anyway because this time they had an emergency so grave that Rondon would allow them to use some of this woman's supplies. Teddy had finally agreed to let Dr. Jose operate on his leg, and her home was going to be the cleanest place they could find for miles. Describing what Dr. Jose had to do to Teddy's leg would genuinely break some rules here, so unfortunately you're going to have to go read that for yourself. Just know it was brutal. Meanwhile, that woman was actually running down a path to her neighbor's house where she knew that her husband and 2 other men were working. And when she told them that they were under attack, the 3 men stealthily snuck back to their house and were going to wait for Rondon's crew to fall asleep so that they could ambush them. They hid in the bushes and observed the party as best they could to get any sort of information. But then the husband, whose last name was Honorato, spotted something strange. Holy shit, that's Colonel Rondon. He whispered it to his 2 friends. Rondon was one of the most famous men in Brazil, and Honorato recognized him from his portraits in newspapers. The 3 men decided that meant it was safe for them to reveal themselves, and Rondon was elated to see them, but he also wanted to explain why they had to use some of his supplies. So he opened the door. Holy shit, that's Teddy Roosevelt. Honorato recognized them both, and he was absolutely floored to see a U.S. president lying on the table in his home, barely clinging to life. Before their expedition had even started, Teddy Roosevelt had borrowed $500 from a friend. He wanted to have it on his person so that he could buy all of the men an extravagant dinner when they completed their mission. With this money, they were able to buy 2 large canoes and many provisions from the Honoratos, who also helped the men find a guide to hire. Teddy had lost 55 pounds by this point, and upon operating on him, Dr. Jose discovered that he had formed another horrible abscess on his right buttock. This was now a race to save Teddy's life. On April 23rd, they came across a general store at the top of a waterfall, owned by a man named Jose Caripe. Caripe also recognized both Rondon and Roosevelt and was like, what's happening? And upon seeing Teddy's condition, Caripe offered to help them the rest of the way up the river, saying he knew it better than anyone else. But during the very last leg of this trip, Kermit's dog Trig jumped out of the boat at some point, something Kermit didn't recognize because he was also ill with malaria. Though he did circle back to search, Kermit would never see Trig ever again, and Kermit was devastated. On April 26th, the men started to notice that the terrain was changing from kind of rainforest to almost a swamp. They scanned the banks as they normally did, and almost all at the same time, they noticed a clearing up ahead. And then they saw it. An American flag and a Brazilian flag waving side by side high up in the air. It was Lieutenant Berenius's camp, and they were all finally saved. I've got bad news for everyone. Though Teddy and Kermit accomplished their goal in the Amazon, it was just about the last good thing to ever happen to either of them. We'll start with Theodore, who was completely bedridden for like 3 weeks after being rescued at Lieutenant Berenius's camp on the Madeira. He finally entered the New York harbor on May 19th, 1914, and was received by a huge crowd of people. And though his family was elated to see him, his wife and children were immediately alarmed when they saw the condition that he was in. Teddy, of course, insisted on walking unassisted off of the ship, adorning a cane for support. And for weeks after this, he was also bedridden, though he was very excited to eventually be hosting speaking engagements where he could describe his journey. But then he began reading in newspaper articles while he was in bed that his trip was gathering bad publicity. There were many people, including then famous explorers, who did not believe that Teddy had ever made this journey at all. One man named Henry Savage Lander, who himself had traveled through hundreds of miles of uncharted Brazilian wilderness, was calling Roosevelt a charlatan, and he wrote, "It seems to me he only copied the principal incidents of my own voyage. I see he even has had the very same sickness as I experienced, and, what is more extraordinary, in the very same leg I had trouble with." Henry was accusing Teddy of having read his book, and that Teddy then took the information from his trip to report as his own journey. Irate, Teddy agreed to host a speaking engagement right away, and it was to be held at the National Geographic Society on May 26th, and this was way before he was well enough to do so. The event sold out instantly, and it was held in a room with a capacity of 800 people that was easily now holding 1,200 on one of the hottest days on record in Washington, D.C. And this was, of course, a time before air conditioning. The author of this book literally wrote, "The stench of rotting meat and vegetables thickened the air around them." And I appropriately annotated the book at this section with, "Hey, what the f?" But this was also a time before microphones, and Theodore was still so weak that even the people sitting in the very front row couldn't understand a word he said. Teddy already had a naturally high-pitched voice that this author described as sounding like he had just sucked in helium, which is kind of funny because he wasn't a small guy and I did not know that about him. But despite not being able to hear any of his speech, nobody moved for the entire hour and a half that he was speaking, and his efforts on stage somehow cleared his name that he had been faking this entire voyage. And the explorers who had been doubting him didn't even bother to show, even though they were also invited. The next several years, Teddy's health would drastically spiral, then slowly recover, then drastically spiral, then slowly recover. His immune system was compromised even prior to this journey, but now it was completely shot. And to make matters worse, that summer in late July 1914, the U.S. entered World War I. Teddy would become obsessed with leading his own regiment in the war, but for many reasons, President Wilson denied him this request. But one of the leading embarrassments Teddy had throughout his life was that his father dodged serving in the Civil War, paying another man to fight in his place. And for this reason, Teddy had drilled into the minds of all four of his sons that if America were to ever call them to serve, they must answer. It was their duty to redeem the Roosevelt name as Teddy had tried to do in the Spanish-American War, and it was their duty to their country. And all four of Teddy Roosevelt's sons would enlist: Theodore Jr., Kermit, Archibald, and Quentin. The elder three would come home wounded in action, but the youngest, Quentin, would never return home and would sadly die in battle. The guilt that plagued Teddy from encouraging his sons to enlist would never, ever leave him, and Teddy would spend his final years depressed, wandering off to places on his property where he could be alone to cry in solitude. And on January 6, 1919, at just 60 years old, Teddy would die in his home, Sagamore Hill, of a broken heart and because of the toll that the trip into the Amazon took on his body. This will be our 11th and final death from the journey on the River of Doubt. 2 dogs, 1 woman, and 8 men would die because of this trip. If you watched the series from the beginning, you know that Kermit Roosevelt was not supposed to be taking this journey down the River of Doubt with his dad because he had just gotten engaged to the famous heiress Belle Willard, the daughter of Joseph Willard, America's ambassador to Spain. Belle Willard was set to inherit a very sizable fortune. In Spain is where Kermit and Belle would get married almost immediately after Kermit returned from his trip in the Amazon. The two had only met one summer prior when Kermit's sister invited Belle to Sagamore Hill, and they got engaged via writing letters to each other. After the wedding, Kermit and Belle moved to Argentina, where he took a job with National City Bank in Buenos Aires. But Kermit was not cut out for an office 9 to 5, and he slowly entered into a depression where little interested him more than his wife and the son she'd just given birth to, Kermit Jr. During this time, Kermit's love for drinking alcohol began to peek its head out, something Teddy Roosevelt was mindful of throughout Kermit's entire life. Unfortunately, Kermit heavily reminded Teddy Roosevelt of Teddy's only brother, Elliott Roosevelt. Elliott was also the father of First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. And yes, before you ask, Eleanor Roosevelt was a Roosevelt at birth, long before she married Franklin Delano Roosevelt. FDR was her distant cousin, 5th cousin once removed. All of Teddy's children were loud, boisterous extroverts except for Kermit, who was an introverted, sensitive bookworm, much like Teddy's brother Elliott. Elliott also idolized both of his parents, and though Teddy had a great relationship with all of his children, Kermit idolized Teddy the most. When Elliott and Teddy's mother died long after they'd already lost their father, Teddy grieved by running off into the Dakota Badlands for years, letting both nature and adventure heal him. But Elliott, who had a young wife and 3 children, took to much less healthy coping mechanisms. He spiraled into an alcohol and morphine addiction that would plague him for the rest of his life. He also humiliated his wife by having several scandalous affairs, something that further alienated him from Teddy, who believed that it was outright unacceptable to stray from one's wife and family. In the end, Teddy stopped having a relationship with Elliott and eventually had him admitted to an asylum in Paris, declaring him insane and incompetent. The following year, Anna would die at the age of 29 of diphtheria, and Elliott would follow her 2 years later, dying of an overdose, leaving 9-year-old Eleanor and her 2 siblings as orphans. Back to Kermit in Argentina, there would soon be something that tore Kermit from his bank job and would add a new purpose to his life: the outbreak of World War I. Kermit immediately enlisted, having always been encouraged by Teddy to serve one's country if the time ever came. In fact, Kermit was so eager to see action that he actually joined the British Army at first, serving as an honorary captain in modern-day Iraq. He then later transferred to the American Expeditionary Force in France, where he also served as a captain. Kermit was actually in Germany with the occupying army when he got a telegram on January 6, 1919 from his brother Archie, who was home in America with severe war wounds. The message simply read, "The old lion is dead." And this is how Kermit found out that Teddy passed away. Without Teddy, Kermit was completely lost, and that night he would write a letter home to his mother in which he would confess, "The bottom has dropped out for me." Not only was Kermit now grieving, but he was also just exiting the fight of one of, if not the most brutal war the world had ever seen. PTSD has always existed, but has only recently been recognized and categorized. And when Kermit returned to the U.S. in March 1919, his life would never be the same. Both Kermit and Theodore Jr. would begin to rely heavily on alcohol, often partying together. But Ted Jr. handled liquor far better than Kermit. At one party in the 1920s that honored American Admiral Richard Byrd, Kermit drank so much that he passed out and was found the next morning lying in a corner of the bar. In an event that mirrored Theodore's relationship with Elliott, Kermit's brother Archie would eventually have to admit him to a sanatorium against his will. Of course, Kermit's problems with addiction also impacted his marriage to Belle, an ambitious, social-driven woman. In the 20s, Kermit actually made several successful shipping ventures and even helped develop the United States Merchant Marine. But much like almost everyone in the 1930s when the Great Depression broke out, Kermit lost everything, including the large fortune Belle had inherited. And they were eventually reduced to renting out their Oyster Bay home and selling all of her family jewelry. But the biggest betrayal of all was that Kermit was wildly unfaithful to Belle, publicly and unapologetically stepping out on her many times, something that would have sent Teddy Roosevelt into fits of hysteria. Despite this, Belle never gave up on Kermit and actually appealed to Kermit's distant cousin, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, on his behalf twice. Once to send the FBI to find Kermit after he drunkenly ran away with his mistress, and the second time was to ask FDR to give Kermit a military role after FDR entered World War II following the attack on Pearl Harbor. And both times times FDR helped her, and during World War II, FDR sent Kermit to Alaska at the age of 52. But Kermit had been mistreating his body for so long that in Alaska, he couldn't do much more than sit in a local restaurant and drink wine. A couple of times, Kermit did convince airmen to let him ride along on missions to bomb the Japanese, and he even became friends with Major Marston, the man who organized Alaska's Tundra Army. One evening, while Major Marston was walking with him, Kermit asked him what his plans were for the rest of the evening, and Marston said, "I'm gonna go to sleep." "I wish I could go to sleep," Kermit replied. And that evening, Kermit would return to his quarters alone and unfortunately take his own life. Before jumping into Colonel Rondon, I want to cover what happened to Lieutenant Joao Lyra, one of Rondon's most loyal men on the trip. Just 3 short years after the Roosevelt-Rondon expedition, Lieutenant Lyra drowned in the Rio Sepotuba while he was attempting to survey it. As the current violently swept him along, Lyra's last act would be to throw his surveying notebooks onto the riverbank so that the work he'd already done would be spared. Even though I'm sure Rondon was devastated by this news, I know that last move by Lyra made him proud, and I wanted to honor Lyra by telling his last moments because he, Dr. Jose, and Rondon are my favorite characters from this book. The book unfortunately does not go into the rest of Dr. Jose's life, but 2 men from this journey would make it to an old age. George Cherry, who lived the rest of his days on his Vermont farm and died at the age of 83, and the indestructible, always fascinating Colonel Candido Rondon, who lived to the impressive age of 92. Unfortunately, the telegraph line that Colonel Rondon toiled away to see the completion of, and a countless amount of men gave their lives to construct, would become obsolete the very year it was completed, because radiotelegraphy found its way to Brazil, rendering the telegraph almost useless. Regardless, Rondon was a major hero and celebrity in his country until the day he died, and year after year he was asked to run for political office, something he repeatedly refused to do. In the 1920s, after meeting him on a trip he took to Brazil, Albert Einstein nominated Rondon for a Nobel Peace Prize, something that never came to fruition but is still a fun fact because, wow, even Einstein was impressed by Rondon. Rondon would go on to be promoted to brigadier general and eventually marshal, and in 1956 the Brazilian government would rename a territory of 94,000 square miles, twice the size of England, Rondonia, in his honor. His efforts on behalf of his fellow indigenous Brazilians lives on in the form of Brazil's National Indian Foundation. But despite all of his efforts to serve the indigenous population of the Amazon, Rondon unfortunately lived long enough to see his telegraph line used against them. In the 1950s, the path that Rondon carved out of the wilderness became a road known as BR-364, and that road brought cattle ranchers, gold prospectors, and rubber tappers right into the interior of Brazil. And all these men stole indigenous land and wiped out entire tribes. When Rondon left the military academy in 1889, the indigenous population in Brazil was roughly 1 million people, but by the time Rondon passed away in 1958, that number had been reduced to 200,000. Of course, this is not the intention Rondon had when he carved this road. So, regardless, thank you, Marshal Rondon, for your tireless efforts in the Amazon and for the well-intended work you did for indigenous Brazilians. I thoroughly enjoyed reading about you, and I have a feeling I'll be reading about you once more in the future. And for all of you who watched every single video in this series, I really appreciate you. This has easily been the least popular series I've ever done on here, but I put a lot of time and effort into these videos, so I truly can't thank you enough for watching. If you were ever afraid of piranhas as a child, you pretty much have President Theodore Roosevelt to thank for that. Because after Theodore Roosevelt lost his re-election campaign in 1912, this time running as a third-party progressive, Roosevelt spiraled into a deep depression. But then, in February 1913, the 2-year-old Museo Social in Argentina invited Roosevelt to host a series of guest lectures at its institution. And Roosevelt accepted, as he was actually a well-respected naturalist as well as a U.S. politician. But then a plan much larger than this began to formulate. Teddy wanted to explore and chart regions of the Amazon that only indigenous folks had navigated successfully before. While he was on this journey, Teddy was also writing scientific articles for Scribner's Magazine, an intellectual magazine that many Americans read. Here is how he made piranhas a household terror. The boats that Roosevelt and his men were floating on were only about 6 inches above the water, and Teddy wrote that his men feared the piranha more than almost anything that lurked beneath them. There are approximately 30 species of piranha, but almost all of these species prefer to hunt things smaller or the same size as them, or to scavenge for their meat. They are known to travel in groups of over 100, but this is more of a protection by numbers method than it is a hunting method. Although piranhas are attracted to the scent of blood and have extraordinary hearing for a fish, they're simply not known to attack humans in any fatal way. But this is not what Teddy Roosevelt had been told by the men he was traveling with, especially by one very fascinating man named Colonel Rondon.